A tycoon throws a lavish party to impress the elite, but humiliates a homeless boy who sneaks in looking for food. What he never imagined is that this little boy is keeping a secret that will change his life forever. What truth from the past connects him to him? The Santini mansion gleamed under the light of the chandeliers that adorned every corner. Guests, dressed in elegant suits and sparkling jewelry, moved about the main hall, where the music of an orchestra filled the air. Riccardo Santini, with his haughty bearing and calculated smile, greeted the guests with the confidence of a host accustomed to power and luxury. The party was not just a social event, it was a declaration of his place among the city's elite. In the garden, away from the hustle and bustle, a boy watched from the shadows. He wore worn clothes and bare feet, his eyes shining with hunger and curiosity. His name was João, although no one there knew his name. He had come to the place by instinct, attracted by the aroma of the delicacies being served. Seeing a tray abandoned on one of the garden tables, he approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The crack of a branch under his bare foot alerted one of the guards, who grabbed him by the arm. Before João could flee, he was taken to the main hall, where Ricardo was chatting with a group of businessmen. "And this?" Ricardo asked, frowning as the guests turned their heads toward the intruder. "We found him wandering around the garden, sir," the guard replied, holding the boy firmly. Ricardo looked him up and down, his cold, calculating eyes lingering on the boy's dirty clothes. Without hiding his contempt, he addressed the little boy. "What are you doing here, brat? Are you here to steal?" João tried to look away, but he couldn't stop his hands from shaking. His silence only made Ricardo angrier. "Look at him, ladies and gentlemen, the future of our society. A little thief who doesn't have the decency to stay away from where he doesn't belong." The laughter of the guests echoed throughout the room, but not everyone shared in the fun. Clara, the housekeeper of the mansion, watched the scene from a corner. Her eyes, normally full of serenity, showed a mixture of indignation and pain. João, his face flushed and his eyes filled with unshed tears, finally gathered the courage to speak. "I just wanted some food." His voice, barely a whisper, was lost among the laughter of those present. Ricardo gestured to the guard to let him go. "Get out of here and never come back," he ordered harshly. The boy did not wait to be told again. He ran toward the exit, his bare feet pounding on the marble floor as the murmurs of the guests faded behind him. Before he disappeared into the darkness of the night, he cast one last glance toward the room. A glance that was not one of hatred, but of a quiet dignity that no one expected from a child like him. Clara felt a chill as her gaze met the little boy's. That expression, there was something familiar about it, something that made her clench her fists and hold back the urge to run after him. As the party continued and the guests returned to their conversations, Clara couldn't help but look towards the door through which João had left. She knew that something had changed that night. What she had witnessed was not just an act of cruelty, but the beginning of a truth that she could no longer ignore. With the music ringing in her ears and the laughter of the guests filling the air, Clara quietly retreated to her chambers. There, in the dimness of her room, she opened a small chest that she kept locked away. Amongst the papers and forgotten mementos, she found an old letter written in faded ink. Her fingers trembled as she touched it. "João," she whispered to herself, her voice heavy with emotion. She closed her eyes and let a single tear run down her face. She knew she couldn't keep quiet any longer. The mansion was quiet the next morning, a complete contrast to the hustle and bustle of the party the night before. The sun's rays filtered through the curtains of the large windows, illuminating the imposing library where Riccardo Santini usually spent his mornings. Sitting in his leather chair, he was leafing through a newspaper with the same coldness he had shown the night before. Clara entered the room, her light steps barely breaking the silence. In her hands, she carried the letter she had found the night before, carefully folded and protected as if she were carrying a treasure. She stopped a few meters from Ricardo, who did not even look up. "Soconsum, Mr. Santini," she said, in a restrained but firm tone. Ricardo left the newspaper on the mahogany table and looked at her impatiently. "What's wrong, Clara? Is it urgent?" Clara took a deep breath, gathering the courage she needed. "What happened last night with that boy? João," she began hesitantly. Ricardo frowned upon hearing the boy's name, briefly recalling the incident at the party. What about him? She asked, her tone a mix of disinterest and annoyance. Clara squeezed the letter in her hands. It's more important than you think. I recognize the child. Ricardo raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. Did you recognize the brat? What are you talking about? Clara took a step forward, holding the letter in front of him. Sir, João is Helena's son. The name Helena, Ricardo's deceased wife, echoed through the room like thunder. For a moment, Ricardo seemed speechless, but his expression soon hardened. That's impossible, he said, his voice filled with disbelief. Clara shook her head, feeling the weight of years of silence finally beginning to lift. No, sir, João is Helena's son, the fruit of a relationship she had before she met you. Ricardo jumped to his feet, his face reflecting a mixture of fury and bewilderment. How dare you say something like that? Helena would never have hidden something so important from me. Yes, he did, Clara replied, her voice shaking slightly but remaining firm. He did it because he was afraid. She held out the letter to him. Ricardo looked at it as if it were a dangerous object, but finally took it with trembling hands. Before she died, she confided this letter to me. I never had the courage to give it to her until now, but after what I saw last night, I can no longer remain silent. Ricardo looked at the letter for long seconds before looking up at Clara. Get out of here, he ordered, his voice low but full of tension. Clara nodded, knowing she had done what she had to. As she left the room, she couldn't help but glance at Ricardo one last time. His normally imposing figure seemed hunched under the weight of the words she hadn't yet read. She closed the door behind her, leaving Ricardo alone with the truth he was about to face. Ricardo stood still for several minutes, holding the letter in his hands. Helena's fine handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable, and for an instant, the weight of nostalgia hit him hard. He pressed his lips together and finally decided to open it, his trembling fingers betraying the facade of control he tried so hard to maintain. The letter began with words that seemed to go straight to his heart. Dear Ricardo, if you are reading this, it means that I am no longer by your side, and for that I am deeply sorry for the pain that these words may cause you. I have kept a secret that has weighed on me all these years, a secret that I did not have the courage to confess to you while I was alive. I hope that you can forgive me for my cowardice and understand that everything I did was out of love. Ricardo felt a lump forming in his throat. He continued reading, his eyes scanning each line with increasing urgency. Before I met you, there was someone else in my life. His name was Andres, and although our relationship was brief, it left a mark that never went away. João. When I met you, Ricardo, I was full of fear and doubt. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you wouldn't accept me. And even more, I feared for my son's safety in a world that judges so harshly. So I made the decision to leave him in the care of others, believing it was the best thing for him. Ricardo let out a shaky breath. His mind was racing frantically through Helena's memories, searching for signs he might have missed, unspoken words or averted glances. But nothing he remembered seemed to fit the image of the woman he loved. Ricardo, I ask you for something that I know is difficult. Take care of João. If one day fate puts him in your path, do it for me, for the love we share. He deserves a chance, a dignified life, and I am no longer here to give it to him. I trust you to do it in my place. The last words of the letter seemed to pierce the armor that Ricardo had built up over the years. His hands clenched the paper tightly, while a mixture of emotions swirled inside him. Disbelief, anger, sadness, and guilt. He put the letter down on the table and raised his hands to his face. For years, he had built his life on certainties, his wealth, his power, his position in society. Now all of that seemed insignificant compared to the weight of a truth that threatened to tear his world apart. But what disturbed him most was not the revelation itself, but the memory of João's eyes the night before. That look full of sadness and dignity had been a reflection of Helena, as if she herself were judging him from beyond the grave. For the first time in a long time, Ricardo didn't know what to do. Ricardo spent days tormented by the words of the letter. He could not ignore the weight of the revelation or João's gaze, which now haunted him in every corner of his mind. Finally, one morning he decided to act. He dressed simply, something unusual for him, and went out from the mansion without escorts or drivers. Clara watched him leave from a window, a mixture of hope and fear in her expression. The streets of the poor neighborhoods were a completely different world from the one Ricardo knew. The dilapidated buildings and tired faces of the passers-by contrasted with the luxury and comfort of his life. He asked several street vendors and neighbors about a boy named João, describing him as accurately as he could. Some ignored him, others looked at him with distrust. But an old woman, sitting on a bench in front of a small shop, finally gave him a clue. "I saw him near the river, next to the abandoned sheds," she said, pointing towards the horizon. Ricardo thanked him and followed his directions, feeling the guilt grow heavier with each step. When he reached the indicated place, he found an improvised shelter. Pieces of cardboard and old blankets formed a space that barely protected him from the cold. Among the rubble, he saw João sitting, hugging his knees and staring into space. Ricardo stopped a few meters away, hesitating about how to approach. Finally, he cleared his throat and spoke, trying to make his voice sound more friendly than usual. "John." The boy looked up, startled to recognize the man who had humiliated him in front of a crowd. His eyes, filled with distrust, narrowed. "What do you want now?" João asked, his tone defiant despite his small size. Ricardo took a step forward, feeling awkward under the intensity of the boy's gaze. "I want to talk to you, explain something to you." João stood up abruptly, taking a few steps back. "Explain to me what? That I'm a poor person who doesn't deserve to be around people like you? You already made that clear at your party." The boy's words fell like a blow on Ricardo, who couldn't help but look away. "I was wrong," he finally admitted. "I was a jerk, and there's no excuse for what I did. But there's something you need to know. Something about your mother." João's face changed when he heard the word mother. His eyes filled with a mixture of pain and curiosity, but he didn't allow himself to let his guard down. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, trying to sound indifferent. Ricardo took another step forward, but stopped when he saw João tense his body, ready to run. "João, your mother was Helena, my wife." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. João stared at him, trying to process the words he had just heard. "He's lying," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm not lying," Ricardo answered honestly. "And I can prove it." João shook his head, backing away towards his makeshift shelter. "I don't need anything from you," he said firmly. "I don't need your help, or your money, or your lies." "I'm not here to offer you charity, João," Ricardo replied, his voice breaking slightly. "I'm here because I want to make amends for what I did wrong." João looked at him one last time before turning and disappearing into the shadows of the shelter. Ricardo remained standing, feeling like he had failed, but also understanding that the path to reconciliation would not be easy. Ricardo returned to the mansion with the weight of the conversation with João still on his shoulders. The image of the boy rejecting him, with a mixture of rage and pain in his eyes, repeated itself in his mind like a relentless echo. That night, as silence filled the mansion, he made a decision: he would not give up. The next morning, she ordered Clara to organize a delivery of clothes, food, and school supplies for João. With everything ready, she personally loaded the things into her car and drove to the sheds where she had found the boy. When she arrived, João was there, sitting on a pile of old wood, staring out at the river. "João," Ricardo said as he approached, carrying a bag of food. The boy looked at him, but said nothing. His expression was defiant, although his body betrayed hunger and exhaustion. Ricardo placed the bag in front of him. "This is for you. There is food, clothes, and some things you might need." João kept his arms crossed, refusing to touch the bag. "Do you think this is going to fix everything?" he asked, his voice full of sarcasm. "You don't understand anything." Ricardo, surprised by the reaction, tried to explain himself. "I just want to help you, João. What I did was terrible, and I'm trying to make up for it." The boy jumped up, his gaze burning with frustration. "I don't want your charity. I don't need anything from you," he shouted, kicking the bag. Ricardo took a step back, stunned by the intensity of João's reaction. "It's not charity," he insisted. "It's my responsibility." João laughed bitterly. "Responsibility? Am I your responsibility now? Where were you when I needed you most? Where were you when I was hungry? When I slept on the street? You know nothing about my life." The boy's words were like blades, each one cutting deeper than the last. Ricardo tried to keep his composure, but guilt and helplessness took over. "You're right," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I wasn't there when I was supposed to be, and there's no excuse for that. But I want to be here now if you'll let me." João stared at him in silence for a moment, his expression swinging between disbelief and confusion. Finally, he shook his head. "You cannot buy my forgiveness," he said harshly. "Not with food, not with clothes, not with nice words." Without saying another word, João picked up his old bag and walked away, leaving Ricardo alone with the things he had brought. Ricardo stood there for several minutes, watching the boy's figure disappear into the distance. Although the rejection hurt, something inside him told him that João was testing him, looking for signs of whether his repentance was genuine or just superficial. That night, back at the mansion, Ricardo sat in the library with a glass of wine in his hand. As he looked at Helena's letter, still on the table, he realized that this wasn't just about repairing the damage he had done. It was about proving that he could change, about being a man that João could respect, not for what he had, but for who he was. Ricardo, sitting in his office, looked at Helena's letter for the umpteenth time, as if the words could reveal something new to him. He had tried several times to get closer to João, but the boy's constant rejections had led him to question himself. He understood that it was not enough to insist. He needed to better understand Helena, her history, and the decisions that led her to hide João. He called Clara, who came into the office with a calm expression, although she knew the conversation would be difficult. "Clara, I need you to tell me about Helena, about the time before we met," Ricardo asked, his voice filled with an unusual tone. Humility. Clara, who had served the Santini family for decades, nodded slowly. She sat down opposite him, her hands folded in her lap. "Sir, Helena was a strong woman, but she also carried many scars. When I met her, she had just arrived in the city with João, although no one knew about him because she kept it a secret." Ricardo frowned, surprised. "Why did you keep it a secret?" Clara sighed. "Because João's father, Andrés, was a troubled man. Helena fell in love with him when she was very young, but he was not the kind of person who could offer her stability. When she became pregnant, Andrés disappeared, and she had to face the world alone." Ricardo looked down, feeling a mixture of compassion and remorse. "How could you raise João then?" "It wasn't easy," Clara continued. "She worked in everything she could, cleaning houses, sewing, but she was always afraid. She said that if someone like Andrés found out she had a son, they could take him away. So when she had the opportunity to work here, she thought it would be safer for João to stay with a family friend in another town." Clara's words echoed around the room, each one adding a new layer to the portrait of Helena that Ricardo thought he knew. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Ricardo asked, his voice almost a whisper. Clara looked at him sadly. "Because she loved him, sir." Helena wanted to start over, to leave behind the pain and the sacrifices she had made. But she always carried the guilt of having left João. "When she fell ill, she confessed everything to me. She asked me to keep her secret, but she also gave me the letter, in case one day you needed to know the truth." Ricardo nodded slowly, processing each word. For years, he had seen Helena as a perfect woman, without flaws or secrets. Now he understood that her perfection lay precisely in the difficulties she had overcome and the decisions she had made to protect her son. "Thank you, Clara," he finally said, in a warmer tone than usual. When Clara left, Ricardo sat in silence, reflecting on everything he had heard. He now saw Helena in a new light, as a woman who had done everything possible to protect João, even at the cost of her own happiness. That knowledge not only filled him with remorse, but also motivated him. If Helena had sacrificed so much for João, he could not stand idly by. He had to earn the boy's trust and show him that, although he had failed in the past, he was willing to change. Ricardo decided it was time for a different approach. João's words kept echoing in his mind. "You can't buy my forgiveness." He had understood that it wasn't about offering material things, but about demonstrating sincerity and commitment. With that idea in mind, Ricardo planned a more personal meeting, away from the formalities and luxury that usually surrounded him. That evening, Clara prepared a simple dinner in the secondary dining room of the mansion. There would be no guests, no music, no extravaganzas, just a well-laid table with modest dishes and a warm atmosphere. Ricardo asked one of his trusted men to go and find João. He didn't know if the boy would accept the invitation, but he was determined to try. João arrived with a cautious expression. He was wearing the same worn clothes that Ricardo had seen before, and his distrustful gaze scanned every corner of the place as he walked behind the man who had accompanied him. Upon entering the dining room, he paused, clearly surprised by the lack of ostentation. "Thank you for coming, João," said Ricardo, standing up to greet him. João didn't answer right away. His eyes fell on the table, where there was a bowl of hot soup and fresh bread waiting for him. Finally, he murmured, "I had nothing better to do." Ricardo smiled slightly, accepting the coldness of the comment. "Please sit down." João did so, though he kept a safe distance. For the first few minutes, silence reigned at the table. Ricardo didn't know where to begin, and João seemed more interested in the soup than in talking. "I want to apologize again," Ricardo said finally. "What I did at that party was inexcusable. Not only did I humiliate you, but I also ignored something I should never have overlooked." João looked up, his eyes shining with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "And what is that?" Ricardo took a breath, knowing his words had to be carefully chosen. "Your mother, Helena. She was the most important person in my life, and now I know she was the same for you." João's face hardened when he heard his mother's name. "You don't know anything about her," he replied brusquely. Ricardo nodded, accepting the reproach. "It's true. I didn't know everything about her life before I met her. But now I'm learning. And the more I discover, the more I realize how much I owe you, João." João put the spoon aside, watching him with a mixture of distrust and curiosity. "Why are you doing this now?" he asked. "If you really cared, you would have done this before." The question hit Ricardo hard. He could see the pain in João's eyes, a deep wound that wouldn't heal easily. "Because I was a coward," Ricardo admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "For years, I refused to look beyond my own comfort, but now I understand that that was a mistake, and I want to fix it, although I know it will take time." João remained silent, processing the words. Although there was still mistrust in his gaze, something in Ricardo's sincerity seemed to have struck a chord within him. When they finished dinner, Ricardo walked him to the door. "Thank you for coming tonight, João," she said softly. "I hope we can talk again." João didn't answer immediately, but before leaving, he turned around and said, "Maybe." It wasn't a promise, but for Ricardo, it was a step forward. Ricardo, determined to go one step further, knew that it was not enough to try to connect with João in private. It was necessary to acknowledge him publicly, even if that meant facing the judgment of the elite that had always surrounded him. With that purpose, he organized a new event at his mansion, this time not to show off his wealth, but to make amends for his mistakes. The evening of the event, the mansion was once again filled with guests, all curious to see what new show Riccardo Santini had prepared. The atmosphere was different, however. There was less extravagance, and soft music created a more sober atmosphere. João was present, though he stood to one side, watching skeptically as Clara accompanied him and offered words of encouragement. When the time came, Ricardo stood before the guests, a glass in his hand. The room fell into an expectant silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining me tonight," he began, his voice firm but full of emotion. "What I'm about to tell you is not easy, but it is necessary." Some attendees exchanged curious glances, while others simply waited, impatiently. "For years I have prided myself on my success, on my position in this society, but that same arrogance led me to make serious mistakes that I am here to acknowledge today." Murmurs began to spread throughout the room, but Ricardo raised a hand to silence them. "I recently discovered a truth that changed everything I thought I knew about my life and my past. I want to introduce you to João." All eyes turned to the boy, who stood beside Clara, motionless under the weight of so many gazes. Ricardo extended a hand towards him, inviting him to come closer. João hesitated, but finally stepped forward. When he was next to Ricardo, the man placed a hand on his shoulder. "João is not just any child. He is the son of Helena, my wife, and therefore my responsibility." The announcement came as a bombshell. The murmurs turned into exclamations of astonishment and, in some cases, disapproval. Some of Ricardo's close friends frowned, while others murmured among themselves. I know this may surprise you, even shock you, Ricardo continued, facing the critical glances directly. But I am not here to justify myself, but to ask for forgiveness. To João, for not having been present before, and to you for having shown you a false image of myself. The murmurs slowly died down as Ricardo spoke with a sincerity few had seen from him before. Helena was an incredible woman. She always wanted the best for João, and even though I failed her, I can no longer ignore her legacy. That is why I ask you to welcome him as part of this family, because that is what Helena would have wanted. When he had finished, Ricardo put down his glass, his gaze searching for João's. The boy remained silent, but something in his expression seemed to have changed. There was less distrust, less anger, as if Ricardo's words had touched a hidden corner of his heart. Some of the attendees applauded timidly, while others remained silent, uncomfortable with the situation. Ricardo knew that his gesture would not please everyone, but that no longer mattered to him. All he wanted was for João to understand that he was willing to do whatever was necessary to correct his mistakes. As the night ended and the guests began to leave, João approached Ricardo. "Do you really think this changes anything?" he asked in a less aggressive tone than on previous occasions. Ricardo looked at him calmly and replied, "It doesn't change the past, but maybe it can change the future." João nodded slightly, saying nothing more. Although reconciliation still seemed far away, Ricardo felt that he had taken an important step towards it that night. The days following the event at the mansion were a whirlwind of emotions for Ricardo and João. The public announcement had generated rumors among the elite, veiled criticism, and curious glances whenever Ricardo went out in public. However, he was determined to ignore the comments. His attention was completely focused on João, who was still living on the streets, although he now agreed to meet with Ricardo occasionally. At one such meeting, Ricardo invited him to the mansion, not for a formal dinner or a speech, but to spend time together in the garden. João accepted, albeit with some reluctance. They sat on a bench under an old oak tree with a wooden box between them. "I found this among Helena's things," said Ricardo, opening the box. Inside were photographs, small mementos, and letters. João looked at them with curiosity, although he tried to hide his interest. Ricardo took one of the photographs and showed it to him. "This was taken on our first trip together. Helena always said she hated posing, but she always smiled for the camera in the end." João took the photo carefully, as if he were afraid of damaging it. In the image, Helena was smiling in a way he vaguely remembered, although the lines of time and pain had blurred some details in his memory. "She was talking about you," João said finally, in an almost inaudible tone. "She said you were good to her." Ricardo felt a lump in his throat, but he smiled. "She was also good to me, more than I deserved." João left the photograph on his knees and looked at the floor. "If I loved her so much, why didn't she know anything about me?" he asked, his voice heavy with suppressed emotion. It took Ricardo a few seconds to respond, choosing his words carefully. "Because I failed myself, João. For a long time, I lived thinking that I didn't need to look beyond what was in front of me. I was selfish, and that's why I didn't see what Helena was trying to protect." João looked up, observing Ricardo with a mixture of disbelief and something that could be the beginning of acceptance. "And now?" he asked, his voice softer than before. Ricardo leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his expression one of absolute sincerity. "Now I want to learn. I want to get to know you, to know who you are and what you need. I can't change what happened, but I can try to be better if you give me the chance." João didn't answer right away, but he took another of the pictures from the box. In it, Helena was holding a small wooden toy. João remembered that it was his, a gift his mother had saved before they had to part. "She always said she would never forget me," João said, his eyes shining. Ricardo nodded, feeling a surge of emotions upon hearing those words. "And I will never forget her. That's why I want to honor her memory by taking care of you." João remained silent, but this time he did not reject the idea. Something in him seemed to soften, as if the barriers he had put up were slowly beginning to crumble. When Clara came out into the garden to call them to dinner, Ricardo noticed that João had not put the photos away from his lap. It was a small gesture, but enough to give him hope. Although full reconciliation was still far away, They were both taking the first steps towards a genuine connection. The morning was cool, and the rays of sunlight illuminated the Santini mansion with a warmth that seemed to reflect the change that had begun to take place within its walls. Ricardo and João were in the Great Hall, surrounded by papers, plans, and documents. Ricardo had decided to found a charity in memory of Helena, a project that sought to help street children. João, although still a little reserved, had shown interest in participating. "Do you really think this will work?" João asked, looking at the project sketches. Ricardo looked at him with a sincere smile. "If we work together, I'm sure we will. I want it to be something meaningful, something that really makes a difference." João nodded slowly, stroking one of the plans with his fingertips. It was the first time someone had asked him for his opinion, and that simple action seemed to give him a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. "Helena always said that helping others was the most important thing," Ricardo added. "This will not only be in her honor, but also to fulfill what she would have wanted." The days that followed were filled with meetings and work. Ricardo involved João in every step of the process, from choosing the name of the foundation to visiting the places where the first help centers would be established. Although the boy was initially shy, little by little he began to speak more, to give his opinion, and eventually to take the initiative in some decisions. On one such visit, João stopped in front of a group of children playing barefoot on a dusty street. He saw in them a reflection of his own past, and without hesitation he approached them to speak. Ricardo, who was watching from afar, felt a pang of pride. João was beginning to find his place, not only in the foundation, but in the world. "Can you imagine if all these kids had a chance?" João asked later as they walked back to the car. "That's what we want to give them," Ricardo replied. "A chance, like the one you deserved from the beginning." The foundation's opening day was a meaningful event. João, now dressed in new clothes he had reluctantly agreed to wear, stood beside Ricardo as they cut the red ribbon in front of a small but promising building. Ricardo's words resonated sincerely with the attendees. This foundation is not just a tribute to Helena. It is a reminder that we all deserve a second chance, that it is never too late to change and do the right thing. João took the microphone next, hesitantly at first, but with a firmness that grew with each word. "I know what it's like to be alone, with no one to help you. And I also know what it's like to think that no one sees you. That's why I want this foundation to be a place where all children feel that they matter, because they really do." The applause was thunderous, and João, although uncomfortable with so much attention, couldn't help but smile slightly. As the months went by, the relationship between Ricardo and João continued to strengthen. They shared memories of Helena, moments of laughter, and even some disagreements, just like any normal family. Ricardo learned to listen to and value João's opinions, while the boy began to trust that he could count on him. One afternoon, while they were working together in the foundation's office, João looked at Ricardo and said, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Ricardo looked at him with shining eyes and replied, "Thank you for giving me a second chance." They both knew that the road they had traveled had not been easy, but they also understood that this was just the beginning. Together, they were determined to build a future where Helena's legacy lived not only in their hearts, but also in the lives of the many children who, like João, now had a chance to dream. The story of Ricardo and João reminds us that we all deserve a second chance, and that past decisions can be redeemed with sincere acts in the present. Sometimes pride and indifference blind us to what really matters: human connections, love, and responsibility. And you? If you had been in Ricardo's place, how would you have acted when you discovered a secret capable of changing everything? Click on the video above to continue this exciting journey of self-discovery and transformation. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire, excite, and make you think about life. See you in the next video.